Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, it puts a smile on my face when I hear that music because it means we are in for a treat. It's another week of the Rec Poker Podcast, Forums Edition. I'm your host, Jim Reed. And if you'd like to learn about me or anyone else on the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew and select amongst a whole page of champions and Rec Poker wizards that can help you on your poker journey. I'd like to thank website AMP and Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. And I'd like to thank this wonderful group of Rec Poker Wizards that joins me every week. John Somsky, why don't you tell us folks a little bit about yourself and where they can reach you?
Well, believe it or not, my name is John Somsky, and you can find me at Poker Geek MN everywhere.
And I'm Rob Washam, and you can find me as Rabman50 everywhere.
And every week we are playing in the Rec Poker home game like we do on Monday night. I mean, there's one every night at 9 o'clock Eastern. Thanks for putting that together, John. Most Mondays we're getting together here to talk poker. We take a post from the Rec Poker forums and we bring it here to the panel to talk about with some of our premium members. And we've got Doug and Jim and Stewie in the chat. So I hope those folks are piping in with some questions and comments as we go. So the first one we're going to look at tonight is a forum post about Hold'em variants. And a few weeks ago, we did an episode talking about 6 max no limit Hold'em versus 9 full ring and how your strategy might change a bit from one to the other. And we also talked a little bit about satellite tournaments and bounties and how your strategy might differ in those kind of tournaments as well. And we didn't have time to talk about all the other ways you can play No Limit Hold'em, but it's such a rich game itself that we thought we'd do a whole other episode just to cover some of that territory. So we're not going to talk about mixed games tonight. We're not talking about other games within the realm of poker. We're just talking about variants within which we can play my favorite game, No Limit Texas Hold'em. So we've talked about bounties, we've talked about satellites, we've talked about shorthanded, and we've talked about full ring. So what are some of the other different kinds of variants that we could talk about? Does anyone have any right off the bat that they think is an important distinction?
Well, I think the first one and the main one is just tournaments versus cash.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, a lot of rooms, and it's the easiest thing you can do is go into a poker room and sit down at a cash game. Those are almost always running every time you come in, and you don't need to wait for the tournament to begin. You can play as little or as long as you want. It is a different style of game. There is not a single winner in a cash game. And you are just trying to make good decisions as long as you can. There is no pressure to win or lose at any given moment. So the biggest difference is in some respects, it is cash games are easier than tournaments in that there is no ICM considerations. All you need to look at is for this hand, what is the most profitable play and make that particular play. You don't need to worry about payouts. You don't need to worry about any other table in the room. It's really simple, straightforward. This hand, how do I make the most money? The other differences are at any point in time, you can always go back into your pocket and pull out more cash. So you don't have to worry about passing up this opportunity because you may get a better one later. You can take both opportunities. There is no cost to it. And finally, the main difference and the thing that makes it a little bit more challenging than tournaments is cash games tend to be played deeper stack. So you're playing deeper stack more of the tournament. A deeper stack game has different complexities to it. In general, it's a little bit more complicated, but you don't have any of the ICM considerations. So, that makes it a little simpler. But you need to be a little bit more careful. You find when tournament players go into cash games, they will often bet or be too aggressive because there is no tournament clock pressure that you need. So you can kind of just take your time. I think that's kind of a real brief overview. Anything else to add to that?
Well, I think it depends on where you're playing. If you're playing in Minnesota, you're going to be playing, typically you're going to be playing limit as opposed to no limit, which is a huge difference in variance of, of what's going on and how you play your hands. When you don't have the option of going all in, it's very difficult to chase somebody off of that crappy little hand that they got. They were able to see a flop with, if you're playing like a 3-6 game or whatever, they're able to see a flop with 7-10, and there's a 7 and a 10 on the board, and you're sitting there with a pair of queens or something. You're thinking you're golden. Well, no, they're not going anywhere. So it's a totally different game when you get into the no limit versus the limit game.
Yeah, and I think tournament players that get into deep stacked cash games, they can kind of find themselves over leveraged a little bit because they're just not used to having so many chips behind when they get to the turn or when they get to the river, that sometimes people can put them in some really uncomfortable positions where, the deeper the stack, typically that favors the better player. And also it definitely favors the player in position. So I think some tournament players get kind of used to being able to just get those, 20, 40 big blinds in good. And it's just a completely different game when you have to worry about not leaving yourself open for counter exploits, on future streets when normally there's just not enough chips in the stack to make that a factor. So I love that. That's all huge, huge importance differences between cash and tournaments. Also, the way that you experience your edge differs a lot in those two. If you're in tournaments, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, you're mostly going to lose money, and every once in a while you're going to hit a good score, and your graph's going to spike up, and then you'll lose a bunch of money again. Then you'll win another thing, and you'll lose a bunch of money. In cash games, you tend to make them. There's still variance, of course, and there's swings, but it's in buy-ins. It's not in hundreds of buy-ins. And so you tend to be sort of a more consistent winner in cash games, small incremental progress.
Assuming you're a winning player.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Yeah, good point.
Well, what would you say? So, winning cash game players, what on average they probably win about 60 to 70% of their sessions? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, something like that. Something like that. Like maybe if you're a small winner, 2 out of 3 sessions, then then you're a winning player, right? Like that.
Yeah.
That's sort of in the grand scheme of things.
Versus tournament players are almost the opposite.
Right.
Of course, they're going to have the bigger scores when they do hit. I mean, if you get triple your stack in a cash game, that's usually a pretty good night. You can get more than that, like 5 or 6 times, but you're not going to get the 20 or 30 times that you often see if you win the tournament.
Yeah. And so actually field size is the next thing I wanted to talk about. So that's a great segue because even just within tournament poker, there is a huge realm of different field sizes. Like if you're playing in international MTT tournaments that are available to anybody that have maybe had a couple of weeks for a bunch of people to win some satellite tournaments and something like that, you can be in tournaments with 30,000, 40,000 players in them. So obviously the multiplier for your buy-in is going to be extreme. If you can get to the final table of that, you're going to do it. You're going to do extremely well, but it's going to happen extremely rarely. So what some players like to do is they like to play in smaller field tournaments where there's maybe a few hundred people playing in the tournament, or maybe there's even just 90 people playing in the tournament, or maybe it's a sit and go that only starts when they get 90 people or 45. There's a lot of single table tournaments out there as well. And the smaller the field, the more we're kind of approaching it like a cash game where we want to have incremental progress. We want to make a little bit of money every day instead of just binking that one big tournament, which is what would get us more inclined to play in the big MTTs. But you don't need to worry as much about your bankroll in the smaller field tournaments. There's not as much of a chance of you going broke. You get to know the players better. You sort of get good at that one thing a little better. Most of the folks that sort of came up through the ranks of online poker back in the day did it by finding one thing that they did well: single table sit and goes, or double or nothings, or something like that, and then they just like stuck with that and worked their edge there.
Yeah, and the smaller tournaments, for the very reasons you just said, tend to have less variance associated with them. If you're a winning player, your cash is going to be more regular in the smaller tournaments, whereas there's more variance, meaning you're going to have bigger wins in the bigger tournaments, but they're also going to be spread out, and you might have longer losing streaks as well, or it's more likely that you will have longer losing streaks.
So then we could talk about a few different kind of tournament types. When I was cutting my teeth, I liked playing double or nothings. And double or nothings were a pretty popular format. What feels like a long time ago now, where basically you would buy in for $10. There'd be 10 players at the table. And when the first 5 players were eliminated, the remaining 5 would double or nothing. Would they double their money, and everyone else would nothing. So it was a way. One of the things that was nice about it was that people hadn't quite figured out. It's essentially a satellite game. First place got the same amount of money as fifth place, and it was just about not bubbling the tournament. So double or nothings, they've kind of gotten a little more sophisticated over time. A few years ago, they changed it. So now you win a certain amount for surviving, but then you also win a certain amount for the number of chips that you have at the end. And so there's an incentive for you to actually continue trying to win chips, even once you've you could fold your way into the bubble. So that's a different strategy to employ there now, but you can see how a different strategy there would take sense. Yeah.
And do you know why they changed those rules?
Tell us, John.
It's because of collusion, actually. In the double or nothing tournaments, it was really easy to have a team of players all play, and you could dump a few chips to whoever had the low stack. And because it didn't matter how many chips you had, you could easily do that and share in the equity. So you had people who were coordinating teams trying to play in the double or nothing. So it was rampant for collusion. And that's why they've switched the tournament format.
Makes sense. And it's funny, as users, we see all these rules, and this is true in live brick and mortar card rooms too. And we don't really understand why they have these rules or why they have all these silly little ways of doing things. But usually there's a reason, and usually the people that are supposed to know, they know the reason. It is.
Yep.
That's a good example. That's a good example, John. So sort of on the other end of the spectrum, we've seen more popular these days, these like spin and goes, or these games where there's a small player pool, maybe just 3 or 4 players, but instead of a fixed prize pool, there's a bit of a lottery where once you enter the tournament, it chooses a factor by which to multiply your buy-in, and then everyone at that table is now playing for a different kind of reward. It's kind of a mix between like the Zoom or Snap play with some of this sort of like kind of gambling up some of this sit and go stuff. So you can see how in these ones, usually there's just like 3 players. It's a hyper turbo, and part of the skill edge from these, honestly, just comes in really focusing on the ones with the higher multiplier buy-ins, and just using the cheaper ones to sort of get to know the structure of the game better and things like that. Have either of you guys experimented with those, or?
Yeah, I have on ACR. They have them. You get in for $5, and they go through what looks like a random generator.
Right.
And you see all these dollar amounts go by, and then it always stops at 10.
Right.
So,
well, and I know the only thing I know for sure is that whatever their algorithm is for determining the odds for it, I'm pretty sure the house still has a slight advantage when they go to breaking that rake out. Something tells me, they're still doing okay.
It's always exciting when you see that $30 come by and it stops on 30, and there's only 3 of you, and each put in 5. So
there you go.
You're making some money then. But no, it's fun.
Yeah, I mainly played them for play money on PokerStars just to try it out. When they first came out, there was a lot of discussion on whether or not they'd even be beatable because the variance is so high. Could a pro realize their edge? And the truth is, you're not guaranteed to realize your full edge, but you can still. People who are good at it can still make. There are people who just play spin and goes and make their money doing that. But it's really frustrating when you sign in, like for the play money, 10,000 play chips, let's say,
Right.
and there are 3 of you playing, and the prize pool ends up being 15,000. And that's just depressing. And
Yeah.
then so you play 2 or 3 of those, whether you win them or not, you barely break even, and then because only the top player gets paid, and then you get one that's like for 100,000, and of course you break that one right away.
But it is. We've all 3 of us has said though there is something kind of fun about it though, right? Like
Yes.
it is kind of fun. It is kind of like a way of having a mix of, you're capping your investment. You're also capping your time investment. But there's also, the chance of a big return. So it is kind of like a fun mix of discipline and gambling and poker and.
Yeah, it is. It is a little different in that, at least on Poker Stars, I can't speak to ACR, but in Poker Stars, you start off with 500 chips. So it's a very short stack tournament. It's a turbo format, so it's really meant for gambling it up. But there is still strategy involved, of which I'm not sure I really know it. But the people who have an edge can still get an edge over the field in those things. But it is the skill edge is quite different than in normal hold'em. You need to learn how to handle it, particularly with the short stacks and with the winner takes all payout format.
Well, let's see if our friend Jonathan Little has anything to say about that, and then we can come back and talk about this a little more.
Wondered whether you should call a preflop raise or 3-bet instead? What do you do when you have a flush draw? Do you raise it, or do you just call? What do you do with ace-king when you miss the flop? Are you tired of guessing about what the right play is with your particular hand? Well, my name is Jonathan Little, and I am a 2-time World Poker Tour champion and creator of PokerCoaching.com, where we offer over 1,000 interactive hand quizzes where you play a hand and then get real-time feedback from our world-class pros. Don't guess and don't stress. Just register for your free account at PokerCoaching.com/recpoker right now.
I'd do it, folks. He knows what he's talking about. There's a man you do not want to make angry. So here we are. We're talking about different no-limit hold'em variants. We've talked about quite a few. A couple others I'd like to talk about. Shootouts. So shootout formats are where no matter how many people no matter how many people are in the tournament per table at the time, whether it's 8-handed, 9-handed, 6-handed, heads up, you play that table down to a winner, and then until all the tables that are in play are down to one player, they just pause. And then when all the tables are down to a winner, they redraw the next round. So a shootout tournament, it's a format where you actually have to play down through your entire table every time. So it's a good mix of full ring and short-handed. It's not a quick format because you kind of have to do it in a series of rounds. So every slowest table of each round determines how long it takes. So it can take a long time. But that is a good format. It's a good way to practice different, 4-handed, 5-handed, 6-handed, short-handed, heads-up play. But I'm not sure. For me, it doesn't really suit my schedule, my structure, to have to kind of like keep dipping in and out of it on demand like that. That's just not a format that I like enough. And plus, if I'm going to be leaning into some poker, I really want it to be one format that I'm playing all day on all my screens. Like I don't want to have to be switching between this one's a satellite, this one's a knockout, because as we're talking about, there's a bunch of different little finesses to how you play some of those edge cases.
Yeah, I personally really enjoy them, the style or the challenge of them, but the structure and you end up spending a lot of time waiting make them really difficult to do regularly.
Mm-hmm. And Jim says he had good success on the one table sit and goes before Black Friday. Yeah, I think that was a real rich area for people like you and I, Jim, with great first names and just a modicum of discipline. That's really all that was required in that time, right?
Yeah, back in the day in party poker, I played a lot of sit and goes. I mean, that was my bread and butter, really, for a long, long time. And I've started doing it on ACR also. And I like it because of the time commitment.
Hmm.
Some of these big tournaments that they have, you get 5,000 players. That tournament, you could be sitting there for 8-9 hours.
Well, they do freaking 5 hours late registration
Exactly.
for God's sake. Give me a break. But yes, that's how you get those big prize pools, right? That's why we're in it for
Yep.
the MTTs.
Yep. So I like this. I like the one table sit and goes because it's the time commitment, and they play a little different than the multi-table tournaments too. There's definitely a different strategy on sit and goes than you have on some of the other forms of hold'em.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, and it's interesting. Like as we were saying before, the more you play these particular little variants, kind of the more you notice those little changes in strategies. And I think a lot of it comes down to field size too, and the structure of the tournament and when to embrace variance and when to shy away from it and stuff like that. And you do kind of like you develop a kind of like a rhythm according to the structure too. Like I know I used to really prefer playing slow tournaments and regular speed tournaments. I didn't play a lot of turbos. I don't really like hyper turbos. I like turbos now though. And it does, you feel like you get into a different rhythm when, okay, now I need to start worrying about growing a stack. Now I need to worry about the bubble bursting. What are the stack sizes going to be? All that stuff does matter. So what about some of these other formats? Timed tournaments where I haven't really played many of these where you play for 2 hours and whoever's still in it counts up their chips and you divide the prize pool according to the chips. Have you guys played with those?
Yeah, I have. They run those here. They're basically just an alternate way to play at a cash game.
Right.
Because here in Minnesota, you cannot play no limit, but you can play no limit tournaments. So they basically, like you can go down, you can play a 2-hour tournament. The first hour, the blinds will be 1-3. The second hour, they will be 2-3. So that the blinds actually, go up.
No.
And then you just cash out at the end. So in that you're playing with tournament chips, so you're not tipping between hands, but they do take their normal, 5 or 10%. Like if you buy in for 300 chips, it'll be $330 to get those. But it's basically just a different way of a less convenient way of playing a cash game.
Yep. It's just a way to get around some
Get around the rules.
Local laws.
Yep.
Hey, make better laws, lawmakers. Come on. That's on you. And then I guess one other thing we could talk about is sort of the difference between freeze-out tournaments and rebuys or re-entry tournaments. There's a little bit of a difference between rebuys and re-entries. It used to be the case that you'd exit the tournament and then you would just, without even leaving your seat, you could just kind of like buy back into the tournament in the same spot. There's a movement now towards having to go kind of like manually re-enter the tournament as though you were a new register. And there's arguments for this and against this. It kind of depends on your perspective. When you make big tournaments re-entry, what you do is you give the people that can afford to max out their bullets to it a better chance of getting to the final table. So no matter who they are, if I'm a recreational player and I'm only going to buy in once, and you're a pro and you're going to buy in 6 times, it's just way more likely that you're going to get to the final table than I'm going to get to the final table. Now, you've paid 6 times for the privilege, so it's not like, I'm not saying it's a better use of your money. It's just on paper, it's just way more likely you're going to get to the final table than I am. So there's people out there that feel like when it's a freeze out, it just sort of makes it fair for everybody. And when there's a rebuy, it sort of gives people with deep pockets an edge. And then there's the other people that feel like, yeah, but I don't want to drive home because I just drove for an hour and I've got, kings in versus aces on the second hand. I just want to enter this tournament again and have a little second life. Plus, I like to get a little gambly every once in a while. I don't want to feel like this is my last chip in play here. What about you guys? Do you have any preferences on that, or is there one that you prefer, or is there a reason why?
Well, in general, in an ideal world where there was an infinite number of tournaments starting, I tend to like to play the full tournament all the levels. So I would prefer to, if I had a choice of re-entering the same tournament or entering a brand new tournament that was identical, I'd always choose the same one that was identical. That's just me. However, you don't have an infinite number of tournaments, so sometimes it is convenient to be able to do the re-entry. I tend not to. Usually, the re-entry points are a fairly bad deal by the time re-entry closes. So I tend not to take advantage of them up until the last moment unless I'm really desperate to play.
And John, you mean because your buy-in is going to get you the same stack it would have originally, but now it's only worth 15 or 20 big blinds or something, and at the
Right,
time it
right.
would have
At the
been.
beginning of the tournament, when you sat down, you sat down with the 100 big blind stack. Now you're still sitting down with the same 10,000 chips, but by the time re-entry ends, it may only be a 10 big blind stack, or sometimes even less, depending upon um, the particular tournament. Now with rebuys, they're a little different. So as Jim mentioned, rebuy, you sit at the same seat, and often you'll have add-ons as well. This is one thing where Daniel Negreanu used to love these, and he called them his own personal crack, where he would play them, and he would learn what the break order of the tables was going to be. And if the break order was going to be such that his tables was going to be one of the last to break, he would rebuy over and over and over again. There was one World Series tournament where I think he rebought something on the order of 27 times, and he had to get first place in order to recoup and win any money, and he did. But what ends up happening is he ends up putting so many chips on that table that the likelihood that the winner of the tournament was going to come from that table was much higher. And because he felt he was one of the best people on that table, he felt that gave his odds much higher. So even though he was making suboptimal plays by putting chips in play that he would end up winning back, it basically allowed him to enter multiple times in the tournament and keep all the chips to himself, as long as luck ran with him enough.
That's a pretty cool strategy. I hadn't actually thought about it on that level, but it's true. And especially if you know your table's not breaking, and if you feel like you have a skill edge, you really should be embracing that opportunity to get more chips on that table, because you're going to be there playing against these people with a better chance to take more of those chips and put them in your own stack. Because that's definitely, if you told me that instead of rebuying, I could just like add a couple extra stacks and be at the end of day two, that would be a different story as well. So like I can see why that would be very valuable. Interesting. I like that, John.
Well, here's a question for you. We talk about rebuys and then there's add-ons. So do you always take the add-on? That's a question.
I almost always take the add-on because it's usually incentivized in such a way that if I was going to take my original buy-in at X dollars, then for 10 times as many chips, it still seems like a good investment. But do people think that if you're at a certain chip stack already, is it less valuable? Like if you have no chips or if you have all the chips, does it make the add-on less valuable, do you think?
I think there are times you could argue, if you were trying to just map out the EV of it, I think there are times when you are probably better off not taking the add-on. But I like to win tournaments. So I pretty much always take the add-on.
I don't recall an add-on tournament where I didn't. I don't think that's ever happened to me.
Yeah, I'd be interested if anyone, listeners, write in with your add-on experiences, and maybe we can drill down into that on a later episode. What else? What other kind of little things like this? I feel like we're almost at the end of this, but we also talked about sort of the difference between registering on time and late registering, like what John was getting at. John likes to use all the levels. He likes to have that deeper stack in play for longer. Plus, from a certain way of looking at it, the longer you go through the tournament, if the worst players lose first, the further you get in the tournament, the stronger the field is. So you're going to encounter the most people that can make the biggest mistakes in the early stages. That's just probably a good time to be involved in that tournament.
Well, and that's if you feel that you have a skill edge on that portion of the field.
Yeah, good point.
I know it also makes a difference. There are people who will argue that you have a better chance of cashing in some of the tournaments if you late reg.
Mm-hmm.
And I know at the World Series, when Chris Ferguson was going for the Player of the Year, that was his approach, was to late reg the tournaments as often as he could. Now, part of it was because it allowed him to play more tournaments, and which gave him more opportunities to get points. And so I don't think that's the highest EV wise money play, but it was the way to maximize his potential for earning points. And the thought process is, yeah, you only have 10 big blinds or something when you get in, but 1 or 2 double ups and you're back where everyone else was, and you didn't need to spend the first 4 hours or 5 hours of the tournament, or sometimes first day even. They some tournaments these days, they allow you to buy directly into day 2.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I think that comes into play if you're a professional poker player and your hourly is important.
mm-hmm.
If your hourly is important, if you can buy in on day 2, that means you able to take day 1 and do something else that's profitable, because you're not making the money on day 1.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times it has to do with the hourlies that people are into. Now, for me personally, I prefer to, like John, I prefer to start at the beginning of a tournament. One of the things that is definitely an issue, though, is the variance that you're going to have in a tournament. If you get in at about when registration is almost over, then the only variance you have is that 10 or 20 big blind chip stack. Whereas early on in a tournament, you've got all of these other players and you're playing against all kinds of erratic play, potentially. You don't know what people's motivations are, and you get stuck in these situations that are going to very much increase your variance. And then you're gonna feel like, well, dang, I'm gonna have to rebuy. So then you rebuy a couple times, and pretty soon you're saying to yourself, why didn't I just buy in right at the end there when I could have?
Yeah, that's right. And it does come down like what is the goal for the tournament? Why are you playing? I think for most of our audience, if you're playing in a big live event, like part of the fun is being there in the room the whole time. Like why would you want to give up on a few hours of that? When you could be kind of, getting it under your belt, calibrating yourself, getting more comfortable with the mechanics of everything. So I'm with both these guys. I'm the same way. I say play it all, get out there, get comfortable, show up early, find out where the washrooms are, give yourself a real chance, make sure you're comfortable at the table, soak it all up, and have fun and kick butt and win a bunch of money. So any closing thoughts other than kicking butt and having fun and making a bunch of money? I guess the one thing for me is there's just so many different variants out there. Find the one that works for you, and you don't have to just play that way or just that kind. But different people have different personalities. We learn differently. We play differently. John Somsky and Rob Washam and I are all excellent poker players. Well, we like to tell ourselves, but we all play in different ways. We have different personalities. We have different playing styles. And some of those playing styles might be more profitable in a particular type of tournament structure or in a cash structure or in something else than in others. Like, so, think about it. You never know, and try some of these out. You might have more fun than you expect.
Yeah, I find, just shaking it up every once in a while, it reinvigorates you.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you enjoy the game more.
Mm-hmm. And then you still get a little variation, but you don't have to try and learn a whole new game like Pot Limit Omaha or, whatever you guys crazy getting up to on these Wednesday nights. But all right, well, I'd like to thank Website Amp, of course, and Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. I want to thank Doug, Jim, and Stewie for joining in the chat. And of course, John Somsky and Rob Washam, and the great Steve Fredlin. Thanks for making all this happen. And all our listeners. See you again next week, everybody.